So this final webinar that we are launching and presenting to you on this last day is peer-led programming for Two-Spirit, non-binary, and trans communities. So we're going to be taking a look at recommendations that participants have, some research that we did on current models that exist, models that we still want to see more of, and hopefully you'll be able to take away different examples of what to consider if you're wanting to create more peer-led programming, peer-led workshops, peer-led models. Yeah. So before I get into some of the information, I just want to take some time to introduce myself if there are new folks here. My name is Maisha. I'm the project coordinator on the TransFormed project at MetRac. I was, prior to this, a PLG member for 2 years, and then I was introduced as a coordinator in early February, and I've been a coordinator since then. I'm trying to practice stating more parts of who I am and what I do. I think on day 2, we had a guest from Two Spirits, Keith McCready, and he provided a really important piece about, stating your identities and verbalizing your teachings and things. So I would like to just take some time to do that and let you know who I am. So in case there are folks watching who also share my intersections, you know that you can participate and give back to the community and be in positions like this and more. So I am non-binary, I use they, them. I'm also bisexual, I'm Bengali, I'm working class, I'm Muslim, and I am an IPV and DV survivor. So this work at MetRac is really important to me because I'm learning so much from everyone, but I'm also able to give back all of the things that I know and all of the things that we're hearing from community members. But aside from that, I'm also a filmmaker and a writer, and I go between the arts and the community organizing work, and I'm really glad to be here, and I'm excited to share a lot of this information with you. MetRac's board of directors and staff are committed to upholding the spirit and intent of the 2015 Truth and Reconciliation Commission's recommendations and call to action. To this end, at the beginning of all MetRac meetings, we make a statement through which we hope to raise awareness, understanding, and respect for the traditional territories of Ontario. We recognize the traditional Indigenous territories on which our organization is located and on which our programs and trainings take place. We recognize the failure of settlers to uphold Indigenous sovereignty of this land, and so we commit to decolonize our organization and bring this history to light. For thousands of years, this land has been the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, Haudenosaunee, and most recently, the territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit River. The territory was the subject of the Dish with One Spoon, Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. This territory is also covered by the Upper Canada Treaties. Today, the meeting place of Toronto, as in the Haudenosaunee word, Toronto, is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island. We are immensely grateful to have the opportunity to live and work on this land. We want to express gratitude to Mother Earth and for the resources that we are using, and honor all the First Nation, Métis, and Inuit who have been living on this land. We are aware that our settler acknowledgement uses language which might differ from language that is used by First Nation, Métis, and Inuit, but we also understand that language is fluid and living, and we respect this diversity. We are aware that not all First Nation, Métis, and Inuit refer to themselves in the same way, so some may refer to themselves in spiritual or religious contexts, while some may use regional names. So I want to really briefly share some information about MetRac and the TransFormed project to give you a little bit of an idea of what we're doing here, which you might already have an idea of because of the past few days, but I just want to give a refresher. MetRac is a not-for-profit agency that was formed back in 1984. So historically, MetRac has been devoted to advancing safety, justice, and equity for women and youth. But with the introduction and creation of this, the TransFormed project, MetRac has expanded its inclusivity efforts by putting time, energy, and research into understanding the long existing rate of intimate partner violence that has happened and continues to happen within Two-Spirit, non-binary, and trans communities. MetRac is committed to partnering with individuals, communities, and institutions to change ideas, actions, and policies towards ending gender-based violence. The TransFormed project is a bilingual community-based research project that is being led by MetRac in partnership with Centre de Francophone, The project seeks to increase access to health and social supports for two-spirit, non-binary, and trans people who are being affected by intimate partner violence. So our overall goal is to increase the capacity of service providers and community leaders by equipping them with the necessary skills and knowledge that they need to either start or continue their journey of how to better support community members through research and through online education like this. Before I move on, I just want to give another big thank you to all the people who were involved on this project, our funders, Public Health, City of Toronto, Department of Justice, the Law Foundation, Senator Francophone. I want to thank our TransFormed peer leadership group who are really, the heart of this project. Ava, Felix, Keisha, Susan, Tala, V, Maybella, the advisory committee, all 20 organizations that were a part of this, and of course, MedTrack staff, Wendy, Laura, our former coordinator, Tatiana. None of this, as we said, would be possible without everyone's team effort. So I just want to really, really say thank you. I also want to thank the Knowledge Hub and Violence Against Women Learning Network for helping promote everything, promoting the symposium, the webinar, and all across Canada, across Ontario, across the GTA. Big thank you to you as well. So in terms of the overview and objective of what you can expect from this webinar is part 2 of a 2-part series on supporting two-spirit, non-binary, and trans people. So in part 1, we focused on what IPV looks like in communities, the barriers that communities experience when seeking support, and what service providers can do to create more inclusive and more well-rounded affirming services and supports. However, in this webinar, we are going to discuss what peer-led programming can look like for community members. So I'm going to start off with a brief introduction on our research survey, our focus groups, our individual interviews, and then I'm going to continue forward by exploring what survey and focus group participants recommended when we are creating peer-led programming, so what you can keep in mind. We are going to look at what models or efforts currently exist, important things to consider when developing a peer-led intervention, the potential for future programming recommendations, which we received a lot of, and to keep in mind a really key important thing, which is the ongoing evaluation of your programming and of your team, so your staff members that are involved. There really is a growing collection of content that's available regarding peer-led training, its effectiveness, and how to go about implementing it, but our intention is to specifically focus on what considerations need to take place and be discussed if you're creating supports and programs specifically for two-spirit, non-binary, and trans community members. So this is information that community members in the GTA have requested that they want to see more of, whether it's in the content of the programming or the practice itself. I think it's really important to keep in mind why we need specific considerations for this community in the first place. We know historically that two-spirit, non-binary, and trans community members have had a lot of trouble accessing supports and services due to so many barriers, whether that's institutional, financial, emotional, physical, and so on. So within those barriers, there is a big realization, I think, for service providers and community members that a lot of programming or services are just not ready to take on the concerns and realities that community members are presenting. And this gap can be filled over time when we take the time to listen to community members directly about what it is that they want to see more of, and when we work together to make sure that proper steps are taken to help our programming succeed. So really honing in on collaboration and open sharing, to make sure that all the proper options that can be considered are in place to address challenges as they arise. Since peer-led programming means that peers with lived experiences of similar issues, whether that is general issues or issues accessing supports and services exist, there are certain strengths and advantages that automatically come with those peers entering these spaces where they are in a leadership position, which is why peer work is so effective and why so many of our participants really talked a lot about, staff representation from their identities, but also having their peers in positions where they are taking on workshops and leading spaces. And if there's already peer environments that exist, really strengthening those and supporting those communities. So just as a brief agenda for you to look forward to, I'm going to be doing a brief introduction, talking about key considerations, learning from our current peer models, specific content that communities want to see. There was so much, but we really took kind of the key things that we wanted to focus and share with you today, the potentials of future programming, and further resources and references that you can kind of think about. So as I mentioned, the need for peer-led programming has been really huge and mentioned by our participants. So as you kind of hear me talk about the considerations, I would really love for you to keep that in mind for the projects and programs you're already a part of, but what you might want to also do in the future, to keep in mind the historical issues and barriers that I talk about, and to remember that we can overcome these barriers by listening to community members. And just as a reminder, when I say peer-led programming, I'm talking about peers with lived experience of similar issues who are involved in as many stages as possible, planning, coordinating, and facilitating. And we also want to encourage peers to be able to move up into higher positions of leadership. So the suggestions that we have today to help us understand what approach is best for this project wouldn't have been possible without information and guidance from a number of people, such as the peer leadership group, the advisory committee, and of course, community members who completed our surveys, came to our focus groups, attended our interviews. I want to take some time again to thank all of them, all the participants who gave such important, vulnerable, intimate information and trusted us to make sure that we share this with you in this way. So thank you so much to all of them. So a little bit about how our peer leadership group model works. The peer leadership group consists of 6 individuals from diverse intersections that fall within the communities that this project aims to help. Since this project had a peer-led approach, the PLG members were very important and crucial to a lot of the feedback that we are working with and for each step of the process every year. The group provided consultations and support from the start of the project 3 years ago, and using this peer-led approach in this project gave us insight into a lot of the successes and challenges that I'm going to go over today during this webinar. The advisory committee was made up of 20 organizations, 20 individuals that operated within the GTA, and they really generously provided their feedback, expertise, and knowledge through so many stages and steps of this project, which, you know, this wouldn't have been possible without them either, and that model that we were working with. So both the combination of the PLG and the AC model really benefited us in bringing this project to you and creating what it is today. The participants of our research model and research study indicated that those who completed the surveys and the focus groups and the interviews really felt like they were heard through this process. So we really appreciate having that available. The survey was created with MatTrack with guidance, by MatTrack with guidance from the PLG and from the AC Council. The survey was fairly lengthy and focused on abuse prevention and intervention. It asked questions about the individual's personal experience, but also their thoughts and opinions on the issues about their personal experiences. Alongside the survey, we were, as I mentioned, really lucky to be able to host focus groups where we did a roundtable style answering of certain questions. So the sessions were recorded with permission, of course, and similarly, the individual interviews were recorded as well. During these sessions, there were PLG members present to facilitate the session, and Carolina Gana, who you might have seen as the researcher on the first day, was there to oversee the sessions and to help out the PLG. I think something so rare and unique, although we hope won't be as rare in the future and hopefully becomes more common, was Carolina's expertise and experience in counseling, which enabled her to supervise our sessions, but also enabled her to be able to help PLG members in case they ever needed decompressing or de-stressing from the work that they did on this project. You know, the content and themes of a project like this are very intense and emotional, especially when members have lived experience and are in the community that they're working and trying to help. So having Carolina on board for these roles was incredibly beneficial. The PLG also gained a lot of skills on how to code and analyze these sessions, which Carolina led. So a combination of that was really, I think, beneficial to that peer model. In total, this including the surveys, the focus groups, and the individual sessions, we reached about 150 people, which is a lot more than the initial 70 that this project hoped that it would engage. The focus groups, as you can see, that we were able to host included trans femmes and women of color, trans and non-binary group, newcomer Francophone Arabic, and a two-spirit group. So these were really intimate groups, and the total number of people who attended were 18. And there were a total of 4 individual interviews that we held. All the participants came from diverse walks of life and from diverse multiple intersections, which we are very incredibly thankful for. Grateful not just for their openness and sharing information with us, but also about being able to engage with such a diverse group of people. We do have a glossary available for you to access later. So we touched on this a little bit over the past few days. The glossary is up on TransFormed's webpage now, which you can access through metrec.org. That glossary has a lot of the terms that I'm going to be going over in the webinar today and that we've been using over the past few days. But just as a quick refresher, I'm going to quickly go over some of the terms as well, so you can kind of keep that in mind. So trans femme or trans feminine refers to someone who's a woman or identifies strongly with their femininity and lives their life as such. Trans feminine can include trans women, multi-gendered people who identify with their feminine side a lot more than masculinity, and non-binary people who identify with their feminine side more often than not. Trans feminine people don't always adhere to typical stereotypes that are expected of feminine folks either, so I think that's important to keep in mind. Women of color refer to people who are women and from different, various race or ethnic groups. Trans is short for transgender, which is an umbrella term, of course, referring to people with diverse gender identities and expressions that differ from stereotypical gender norms. Non-binary is a gender identity that does not exist rigidly or exclusively on the gender binary. So non-binary identities are really varied, and they can include people who identify with some aspects of the binary identity while others may reject it entirely. When we say newcomer, we're referring to someone who has recently arrived in a place, so being new to the area and the activity and the situation. And finally, two-spirit is a term that is used by some Indigenous folks, not all, to describe their sexual, gender, and/or spiritual identity. It's someone who typically is understood to have masculine and feminine spirit. But I will say, as we heard Keith McGrady say on day 2, all Indigenous people, some may use the term, they may not. Everyone explains their teachings and their identities really differently. So I encourage you to keep learning about that and thinking about that and thinking of all the different ways that people are able to describe themselves. So in considering key considerations for peer-led programming, some of the things I want to touch on are intersectionality, cultural sensitivity, diverse options, being trauma-informed, safety planning, and keeping practicality in mind. There are elements within your programming that should really be explored and understood by all staff when you're in the planning phase. So grant writing after receiving funding, pre-grant writing, even if you're not applying for things and you're still planning to create programs, a pilot testing phase. It's really the work that takes place before the programming that actually starts, the work that takes place before the programming is actually launched or introduced to the public. These considerations are good to include in your process and directly reflect on and respond to what our community members asked for in our research study. In the next section, I'm going to be going over specific quotes and recommendations, but in this section, I'd like to take a bit more time to go over some of these keywords that are really important to our community members and research participants, so you really have a good idea of what we're talking about. So to begin with, many participants mentioned a need for having trauma-informed practice and providing a trauma-informed practice. That ties us back into a few other topics to clearly go over, such as intersectionality, culture sensitivity, some of those other things that I mentioned. Many participants come from backgrounds where, they're living with such intense trauma and mental health worries due to various forms of abuse that they faced due to their gender identity, gender expression, and experiences of intimate partner violence. They need spaces and people who are informed about what trauma is, what it looks like, how it functions, what kind of impact it has, and specifically what the history and current day state of trauma is within 2S, LGBTQA, and two-spirit, non-binary, and trans communities. While many marginalized folks come from places in their life where they have to deal with mental health concerns and trauma, there are specific deep-rooted challenges that two-spirit, non-binary, and trans folks face due to their gender and due to almost, you know, an invisible space for intimate partner violence concerns that isn't really discussed a lot, whether that's due to a lack of data collected, a lack of prioritizing, or a combination of both. That I think that really needs to be kept in mind as programming is being created and guidelines are being constructed and policies are being formatted. Similarly, the IPV challenges that these community members face come with background issues related to gender identity expression. So you can't really prepare to serve community members without understanding where they are coming from and what exactly they need. Trauma-informed practice is really about knowing the links between various causes of trauma, such as barriers faced when trying to access healthcare, substance use, abuse, and making sure that someone is not re-traumatized or further traumatized when they are accessing a service or support. So when someone is already traumatized and marginalized, the last thing you want to do is further marginalize them, especially when they're seeking support at an event or program that is meant to provide support and healing, which we know is already very difficult for community members to do. It's very hard for them to come forward and talk about that. Peer support can really help create that safer environment where community members feel that staff have created an environment where they value building trust, empowerment, collaboration, and acknowledge the importance of having knowledge and continuous learning about institutional issues that affect people who are attending their programs. So for example, keeping in mind historical gender barriers. Being trauma-informed also helps providers be culturally sensitive to specific needs of individuals as well, and thinking about, you know, where they are coming from in terms of their life experience and their background. So for example, if there are certain things that they've been through, if they come from certain ethnic backgrounds or cultures, you know, we had participants who self-identified as Asian, South Asian, Indigenous, Black, and so forth. So having cultural sensitivity means creating another layer of trust. When community members are able to tell that they can come to a group where they don't have to explain or justify parts of themselves, or, you know, if they do want to explain something, it's in a safe and trustworthy space, it makes them feel a lot less like an outsider. One of the quotes that we mentioned earlier today, a participant said, you know, I came into a space and was trying to disclose my abuse, and I felt like people were looking at me like I was from outer space. You know, being, for example, being in a non-binary focus group as a non-binary person means that you get to just enter that group and that space the same way that being in a gender diverse Black focus group or a gender diverse South Asian or a gender diverse Indigenous focus group means. So like those aspects of an individual's identity become the norm in that space. They don't feel like an outsider. But even within those categories, there are so many more specific and individual communities, neighborhoods, and countries, and so on. So there are so many possibilities for you to create specific kinds of programming that get very deep and specific, which is what people are requesting. The final three considerations to make when planning your peer-led programming or interventions are having diverse options, practicality in programming content, and safety planning. So when you are creating programming for Two-Spirit, non-binary, and trans communities, it's important to remember that each of these identities comes with their own historical challenges and current day progress and successes. It is more effective to have individual programming for Two-Spirit communities rather than lumping it all together with other communities. Issues that are specific to Two-Spirit community members will be easier to explore that way, for example, and to help community members heal from or discuss if they're able to be in a program that's specific, like specifically focused on the institutional barriers that their community faces or solutions that their community has asked for. These conversations deserve the time and space to be properly explored away from being grouped together with non-Two-Spirit or non-Indigenous programming. Yes, there will be non-binary Two-Spirit folks or transgender Two-Spirit folks, or even Indigenous community members who don't use the term Two-Spirit at all, but it's important to provide them with a space where they can be with their own community. And we heard this on day 2 from our Two-Spirit participants. You know, people are saying they love their community, they trust their community, they need to be in spaces that have those traditional approaches. This is also similar to non-binary community members benefiting from being with other non-binary folks in a space that is dedicated to their community's programming. Trans women deserve spaces that are dedicated to their unique challenges. Trans men deserve spaces that are curated and made for their specific histories and concerns. There was an article I read where someone said, to be able to say, I'm a queer man instead of a queer trans man, there's such an impact on being able to very specifically say who you are and to not have your identities negotiated at the door, to fully enter a space and say, this is who I am, and I know I'm in a space where I can fully say that and be that person. So having diverse options is a strength. It means listening to community members when they say they need spaces where they can freely talk about their identities and focus in on just that. Another important element is having practical content in your programming. So community members, for example, in our survey and focus group stated that they wanted a mix of programming that tackled skills. So having anger management skills, learning to create boundaries, self-confidence, but also healing and counseling and practical life lessons or skills. People wanted financial knowledge, housing information, shelter information, job search help. So having a good mix of programming that aims to explore various aspects is a really good way to make sure there's a well-rounded intention that's going on in that programming. Safety planning is a final example that I wanted to cover and go over because it's something that I feel is really important to consider in your programming should anyone ever require that additional assistance. So there are two directions that safety planning can go towards. It's useful to take into consideration when planning how a group will function, what kind of specific safety planning you might need for that group. For example, having resources available for further support, having a professional trauma counselor available to debrief with folks after the group is completed. Another example might be to have guidelines and steps if it's deemed that someone is in danger either from themselves or from others. Setting aside time to talk to an individual about what support they need, such as having, maybe a safety contact list, things to keep on hand or pack away over time, what to consider in their planning. You really want to hear from the individual what kind of planning they need rather than assuming that you know exactly what kind of support they need. There isn't one way to create a safety plan. What works for one person isn't going to work for somebody else. What has historically worked in the concept of safety planning might not work anymore today for the group or the individual that you're working with. So it's really important to keep in mind different solutions and to remember that what's effective for somebody might not be effective for somebody else. So moving into current GTA peer-led programming and what we can learn, as I briefly mentioned before, there are quite a few examples of peer-led programming and efforts in the GTA, but there's a lot of room to grow and to create content that is specific to the communities that we're serving. So using research from some organizations has been really helpful from us, and we wanted to include that alongside recommendations based on our research study, PLG suggestion, and AC suggestions. I was very lucky this year and around last year to be able to speak to two organizations for more details about their suggestions for peer-led programming and for some information on their past experiences, what's worked for them and what hasn't. So I was able to speak to Marianne Park-Ruffin, who is the founder of Network of Women with Disabilities, and Chris Leonard, who was the former health promotion director at Black Coalition for AIDS Prevention, Black CAP. My conversations with the both of them echoed a lot of what was already mentioned by participants within our survey and at our focus groups. So we spoke a lot about specific considerations and thoughts that they had on what was important in peer-led programming, what challenges to consider, and how to set very clear intentions early on in the planning process. So when I was speaking to Marianne, we focused on having disability awareness and that privilege is a very shifting thing. Attitude accessibility as a skill within peer workers is something that really impacts a program and the way that participants will experience it. So Marianne said, it's not what someone says, it's how they say it. So learning to facilitate someone's experience is the key to effectively engaging community members because it's based on their specific needs, which is something we heard a lot in the survey as well. A direct quote that we received really stood out to me from a community member in relation to the question, what can be done to bring more awareness about IPV? So this participant said, who cares? Nobody cares about us anyway. And I think that's a really sad but really powerful, impactful thing for us to hear, because we need to hear the reality of how community members are feeling. So facilitating someone's experience based on their abilities and traumas means asking everyone about their needs before they are asked. So for example, someone may have low vision, they are visual impairment, or be blind. While one person may need a fair amount of light, some people might be light sensitive. So being aware of things like that and things like transportation help, considering it like, someone's scheduled medication times and how it impacts a participant's mood, the physical placement of people and things in a space, how you speak in relation to your tone, your speed, your volume, food accessibility at your meetings and programs, disability considerations and safety planning include being mindful of all of these details and being able to make individual and specific plans for participants depending on what their unique needs, ability, and capacity are. It's important to note the unique ways that people get abused that mainstream people don't recognize or see. So for example, participants might experience abuse by having someone refuse to take them to the store to get essentials and telling them to take the transit when they've never done that alone. So Marian said, the mechanisms to become marginalized, the mechanisms to marginalization might be different, but how we all feel is the same. So these are really important conversations to factor in during the program development process. And I recognize it's a very difficult conversation to have, especially for folks who aren't used to it. But this is something that, I'm mentioning to you now that you should be keeping in mind, because we're hearing from our AC members, from our PLG, from our participants, that there's such a lack of disability consideration in a full-rounded way. And that is something that really needs to change. So balancing out the program development and peer training process is really important in this sense, because putting more weight on one versus the other can create issues in other departments. So unconscious bias is a huge part of this field that still needs to be talked about more often. Respecting and acknowledging that everyone comes with their individual habits and biases, including participants and peer educators. It's really important for peers to remember that, peer workers. So, your biases don't get checked at the door. If you make a mistake as a peer educator or program developer, it's much more beneficial to your participants if you own it, which we had some of our PLG members mention as well. The last thing we want, is for marginalized folks to have, to go to a program or service and feel even further marginalized all over again. So it's really important to have a non-judgmental attitude and inquisitive mind. What Marian describes this is as being open, free to answer, free to be asked, and free to reject. So reflecting on what you want to see in a facilitator really directly impacts the experience that people will leave with. We ended our conversation kind of agreeing that, if you do it right, if you have more ambassadors and leaders who continue peer work in their own lives and circles, it's going to have a much more positive impact on the community than what's happening right now. My conversation with Chris at Black Cap was mostly focused on the peer educator experience and the importance of setting clear goals and intentions early in the process, while also balancing the program development process along with peer training processes. So Chris talked a lot about Black Cap's ACB trans and non-binary harm reduction program and some of the challenges that they faced, which were moments for the team to really learn from. So he said, engaging the community is not done often or is rare, so building relationships takes time. It's important to factor time for that and factor in hiring the right coordinator or peer worker. Having time to really sit with the community during your programming and service sessions means having more meaningful engagement. The work at the beginning when you're planning this is very important. So Chris noted two very important things. He said meaningful engagement with the community is important in the beginning and through the whole process. And two, hiring people who bring passion and strong motivation is a strength to consider, even if they don't have all the expertise. So when you're hiring folks to be in these positions to, support and take care of community, to not just focus on, are they experienced? Do they have academic background or years of experience? It's also really important to look at if the person is really passionate and motivated to work in this position. We are going to include references and more points of information aside from our own at the end, because we know that there are some organizations that have really great experience, research, and knowledge on peer-led work that we think it's important to share and for you to look up. Stella's Place has a RAP program. The Ontario Peer Development Initiative has peer support at Lighthouse of Caring Connections, which is available online. The Mental Health Commission of Canada has Making the Case for Peer Support, which is also online. The 519 has a large amount of community-led programming. There's so many different resources and things. So if you want to further look up on that, you can feel free to email us and we will link you those. So in terms of barriers, through the focus group, we heard a lot about loneliness and isolation. So the fear behind a lack of community sharing sometimes being available in programming spaces, about danger or safety issues, the lack of services available for people at different stages of their financial goals. There was a specific community quote, that someone was saying that they faced isolation due to a lack of resources that were specific to two-spirit, non-binary, and trans experiences, and how dangerous and lethal that can be to the community. The main questions that were asked in our survey were, and in our in-person groups, were suggestions on creating awareness about IPV. So what information are people looking for? What types of information would community members like to receive? And from whom? And why didn't people use certain resources? So I think it's really important to note that people's ability to access a lot of the services they mentioned or that they want to see more of is affected by things like chronic long-term illness and mental health issues. So we had 49% of participants say that they use substances to cope with stress and trauma. 45% said that they experience transphobia often or very often. 37% that they said that they experience discrimination often or very often. 53% said that they lack companionship often or very often. So we heard a lot from community members. I was present at one of the focus groups. I heard so many people say that they were so lonely and isolated. They wanted to connect with more community. They wanted spaces where leaders created opportunities for community members to connect, because community members often can't do that on their own. So they're looking to organizers to see, can you create spaces like this? 46% said they feel left out often or very often. And again, 54%, such a huge number said they feel isolated often or very often. Some of the reasons that people said that they didn't use resources was because of negative experiences, using resources or supports in the past, resources not being responsive to community needs, not being inclusive of identities, not welcoming to identities. Reasons that people didn't access the help that they were given was because they didn't trust those resources or supports, because they weren't responsive to community needs. Again, they weren't inclusive, they weren't welcoming. The sources are very white-based and not keeping racialized community members in mind. So, spaces and staff might have very little understanding of how to treat people of color, especially health service providers. It was mentioned that a lot of people feel that a lot of health service providers have zero understanding of intersectionality and anti-oppression. So with that in mind, now I want to really talk about what the community wants to see. The community talked about safer spaces that they can trust. So that was one thing. People are having difficulty accessing spaces, services, and supports due to a lack of representation, and therefore there's a lack of awareness that is unique to their needs, and it makes it difficult for them to trust people. Trusting spaces means being able to be open and comfortable, letting your guard down, and therefore being able to fully provide the information that you need to express what you want to say. It's not uncommon for community members to feel that they need to either negotiate their identities at the door or constantly provide disclaimers to back up their needs. In an ideal situation, you are creating an environment where someone feels that they are not entering a space where they need to carry those disclaimers and negotiations around. The need to do this comes from a place of worry or fear or past discrimination. Fear that you cannot be served or helped without hiding parts of yourself or minimizing parts of your experience. Community members really deserve to be able to express themselves and to have access to trustworthy spaces and to not have to worry about these things when all they really want is to be heard and supported. The types of programming requested was a really big thing. So this is one of the themes that came out of our survey and focus group. Community members want programming in spaces where the people in charge are aware of their intersections, the trauma and the trouble that they come with, the positivity and potential for success that comes with overcoming those traumas or from building positive life skills. So programming that is suited for people at different stages of their life, whether they are just starting out with exploring their skills or their identity, whether they are struggling or are now in a place where they can, they want to access programming or skill building for those who are now comfortable and confident in their day-to-day lives. There really is a gap of programming holes that can be filled if different folks' needs are being met depending on where they are in their lives. We heard in the surveys that there needs to be more general skill building programming for gender diverse community members. So ranging from managing your emotions to finances, all the way to having trauma-focused art groups, counseling groups, campaigns that they can be a part of through programming. So community members are also asking, we want to be involved in campaigns. We want organizations to help set up that situation and that space. Workshops for young adults or for adults. So having a variety of ranges, that range of people that can access your programs. There was an incredible amount of suggestions that were made on the types of peer programming that people specifically want to see, but I just want to quickly touch on a couple of them in the next few slides. So in terms of preventing partner violence, folks wanted to see identity-specific counseling, support groups in newcomer communities, how to learn different skills like interpersonal skills, working on issues that lead to violent behaviors. Often the cycle of violence exists in our communities in a way where, yes, people are experiencing abuse, but because they don't have support, sometimes they're also maybe passing that abuse on. So they want support working on issues that could lead to violent behaviors or feelings or unhealthy scenarios. They want education resources being available online and in person. So that is an accessibility component. Resources for religious or spiritual folks, shelter protection for two-spirit people, two-spirit specific programming and accountability process models. When seeking supports, they want to see trauma-informed care, just like I mentioned, a variety of things like workshops, conferences, support groups, the ability to directly speak about relationship abuse. They want advice from trans peers, maybe advice with spiritual help, staff competency in working with trans people. So that's really that knowledge gap component that we tried to tackle over the past few days. They want to see community accountability processes when things go wrong. What can communities and organizations do? Staff who are trans competent, again, very specifically, such as understanding of polyamory, understanding of different queer identities, about being fluid and non-binary affirming, spaces where they can talk about trans dating and relationships and what that's like. Spaces where trust can really be built and rapport, which is a really valuable process. When we asked what type of information on healthy relationships, unhealthy relationships, abuse in relationships, or dating that community members were looking for, they said they were looking for things specific to their identity. So if they're Black, Indigenous, people of color, trans, non-binary, specific to their relationship dynamics, whether they were monogamous, polyamorous, in open relationships, related to looking for specific information about trans misogyny. Again, I want to really key on some folks said that they wanted to learn how to set boundaries. How do I set emotional, physical, sexual boundaries? How do you take care of yourself in a relationship? They want to understand different attachment styles. We've seen an increase in community discussion talking about what's an avoidant attachment style, what's an anxious attachment style, what's a secure attachment style. And really, like the last point on this really stood out to me. People want to talk about shame and stigma attached to my partner. So they, I heard people say that they wanted to come to spaces and be able to come with their partners so they could talk about things together. And I think there's a big lack of that. So people are really asking for that. In terms of what type of information they were looking for, they also said nuanced resources related to healthy relationships, a need for accessible French resources on healthy relationships, diverse relationships, violence in relationships, and safety planning. We talked earlier today about how there's such a lack of resources in French. People, French-speaking folks are not able to find access to the same resources as English-speaking folks are. They're looking for information on disclosing gender, meeting and becoming sexual for the first time, info on safety for casual dating or sex work, resources for young people in unhealthy relationships. So we created that healthy and unhealthy relationships resource, which you can access on the TransFormed webpage in response to that. More information on impacts or how to mitigate not disclosing your trans identity to folks when you're meeting them for the first time. In terms of like additional recommendations and suggestions, folks said that they want to see ongoing trans 101 training or information sessions for those who work at shelters. So not just for shelter workers, but also for shelter users. The deaf community said they want deaf ASL video counseling and crisis lines to access immediate support. Indigenous folks said that they wanted talking circles, more focus groups, more traditional talking spaces, more creative spaces such as art therapy and community spaces, different varieties of support groups, maybe even trans-led, more two-spirit, non-binary, and trans-led agencies that are specifically for those communities, as well as affordable access to formal education for trans individuals to be able to provide a better service to the community. So I kind of mentioned briefly earlier, community members are not only looking for supports for themselves, but they're looking for ways to support people by also giving back. So they want to know, how can I be involved in the community? How can I, work and live as a peer and give back to people? The final kind of parts of this in terms of this webinar are looking at the potential for future programming. So innovation, open sharing, open accountability processes, and the importance of ongoing evaluations. So innovation in terms of ideas and possibilities is what I'm talking about. So many models exist, and there are many values and intentions in those models, but there's also a lot of potential for creativity, not just in terms of content, but in terms of outreach and inclusion. There were so many suggestions made for the types of programming that participants wanted to see, and many of this programming does not exist and has never really existed before. So there is room for you to think outside the box in terms of how you want to support and collaborate your teams and community members or external teams to make this possible. We talked a lot about open sharing over the past 2 days. I really want to stress this. So open sharing, what I mean is that's in terms of collaborating and sharing with other organizations, getting information from others, increasing collaborations, being open about your own research and results so that we can all, really build each other up and create a community that fosters and values open sharing, because we see the benefits of that, and how it creates unity and how we strengthen each other with that. We had a direct quote today in our the first presentation that we had from community members who said, why are so many different agencies having such similar short-term programmings? Why aren't they coming together to support each other to create longer, more effective programming? There's really a big lack of that. Open accountability, what I mean by that is accountability in terms of caring for your participants, caring for your staff, having a process for when challenges or issues come up so that it can be equitably solved, and creating that opportunity through your programming so that at the end, when you are evaluating and looking for improvements, that is available to you. I really want to stress that, it's open accountability when issues come up with participants, but also you want to create an accountability and a safe space for your staff as well. As a quick reference, when we think about the structures within agencies as being about the impact that something has on everyone involved, we see this as the impact is made through all levels, through supervisors, managers, coordinators, peer leaders, participants, and community members. It's really important to keep all of them in mind and to keep create programming that keeps everybody in consideration and isn't just made to fit, made to suit one person in that cycle of people who are involved in creating this programming. And finally, when we're talking about having an ongoing evaluation model, having a method or process for this evaluation is really important. So you want to be able to analyze how your programming is going so far, what improvements can be made, what things need to have more time spent on them, or what you can cut back on, how the content needs to change, how certain challenges can be approached, what risks can occur, or what has occurred already. I really believe that practicing this in an ongoing way helps with keeping your efforts and research up to date rather than waiting till the end to solve issues or make adjustments. There are many ways to be involved in the planning process for something like this. Some people use incentive-based evaluations while others might use purpose model. It's really up to you to kind of discover what works for you and your agency. If you can prep this part of the process ahead of time as much as possible, it really makes a difference because then you are prepared. It's unavoidable that you will have issues in the midst of things. You get to decide what your evaluation process looks like in an ongoing model. And at the end, when you're looking back on your participants, your content, and what that means for the future of your programming, you can trust that you took that time to really build that evaluation model. So the slide up ahead is just some of the resources that I mentioned earlier. I just wanted to briefly touch on in case you are curious and looking wanting to look out for some of these things. This webinar will be posted and shared, so this slideshow will also be shared with it, so you can look back on that to touch up on some of these things. So that's the end of this webinar. I really want to stress that, you know, we had so many amazing recommendations. We were able to touch on a couple of them, and you'll be able to get back to them when you view this webinar again. But I really want to stress the open sharing and the evaluation model. You want to create diverse programming, yes, but as service providers and agencies, you want to be as prepared as possible. And we've provided you with so much information on what community members really need to have a safer space for them. So this is a really good starting point on the journey to look deeper into some of these details. Over the past 3 days, we really stressed the importance of evaluation of the symposium from all of you. We are going to be emailing registrants to make sure they've filled out an evaluation, because this feedback is really important to us, so we know, you know, this is part of our evaluation model to find out how we can better serve you and provide information to you and serve community members, how we can better share information, what things we might want to consider differently next time or keep the same. This evaluation is really important for that, because we get to directly hear from you and hear about your experience of what you learned over the past 3 days, and your experience also of some of the resources that we touched on and talked about, whether it was our resources or other folks' resources. So please take the time, if you can, to scan this. And if you want a link, we will also be sending that over as well. I'm not sure if we can share that in the chat now, but if not, we are once again emailing registrants from each day to make sure that they have that evaluation filled out whenever they can.
The link's in the is in the chat bar now.
Okay, awesome. So if you want to take a few minutes just to go head over there and fill that out, that would be great. I'm just going to check the chat to see if there's any questions that folks have right now while you're going over to check out the evaluation. So there are 2 questions in the Q&A. I think they might be from earlier sessions, but I'll still quickly address them here. Someone mentioned, have you heard of the Gender and Sexuality Galaxy created by Action Canada? I'd be interested in your feedback on this resource. It uses a galaxy, so there's no end and is constantly expanding. I haven't heard of this. I'm going to share this in the chat as well, so folks can check it out, but it sounds really like a really incredible way of kind of understanding gender, and I do kind of see it as a constantly expanding infinite thing. So I'm going to share that in the chat. Thank you for sharing that, Kylie Bukowski. Thank you so much. I've just posted on the chat so folks can check that out. And I will take some time later today to check it out. Someone else was asking any tips on how to introduce trans inclusion in a residential violence against women shelter in more rural Ontario, where basically half the staff are still in the 1990s. Oh, that's a heavy question. I would say I want to echo, I guess, what I said earlier, and Burka, Felix, and Susan kind of said on introducing resources and materials in an environment or space where that really is something that doesn't exist for Two-Spirit, non-binary, and trans folks. I would say look at what your position is and how much of an impact you have and how much power you have. Often I find for spaces like that where staff are really just very set in past ways is to look for resources and materials that are supported by large funders. I know that's something that shouldn't be the case, but I find in that situation, it can be really helpful if you're finding materials to email people or bring up and say, oh, look, so-and-so were involved in funding this project, because that can often be a way for those folks to be like, maybe I should look into this. So that's always a really good starting place, in my opinion. So for example, if you were sending our resources over you could, the way you phrase it is really important in spaces like that. So I would say, let people know, I came across these resources and materials. They're being funded by these folks. It would be great if you took a look and really stress who is behind it. Because again, although that shouldn't be, a way to talk about the value and importance of a resource, for a lot of people, those people, the funders involved behind it, kind of create like a light in their head for, oh, maybe I should look into this. Hopefully that's helpful. If you have any further questions around how to specifically introduce these resources in your specific organizations, I would encourage you to email me and we can kind of assist you on getting further into that. So we have a final question here. Any tips on how individual social service workers can make their space more LGBTQ inclusive if it's not necessarily a space specifically designed for LGBTQ people? I think already as an individual taking on this task, I just want to say that is a lot of work, but I think this is a great question. If the space isn't necessarily specific to LGBTQ people, I think starting with a general conversation or introduction into why you need to have that conversation is important. You can present resources and materials to folks, but oftentimes, unfortunately, they really need to hear a specific why. So if you're saying you want to introduce a resource or material, folks are going to need to hear from you who needs this resource and material. Unfortunately, that's the case. They need to hear, well, why are you introducing this? Who specifically do you think this is going to help at our organization or space? So I think maybe framing it in that way and approaching it in that way might help. If you're already someone who has a lot of research on that and you want to share that, I encourage you to start talking to folks at your organization first who you trust, and you can slowly build that that direction with and strengthen, and hopefully more people can get involved in that. I think it's also, I just want to say small steps are really important. I know there's so many big barriers and issues to tackle. We can kind of get overwhelmed and thinking there's so much to do. So it's okay to start with small steps. It's okay to start talking about it in meetings and conversations. If you have, as an individual social service worker, whoever you're working with, if you want to, like the way that you frame your conversations with people, if you want to start introducing step-by-step little things about, I'm able to provide this kind of support, or I'm actually knowledgeable about this and I can provide this. The example that you set through what you do and say is also a really good first step. Okay, so we're at 5:15. I want to honor everyone's time and not, push beyond this, but I really just want to say thank you to everyone again who stayed to attend this. Again, this will be available later for you to view. If you have additional questions that are more specific that we weren't able to get to, don't hesitate to email us. I'll put my email into the chat again, and then you can contact us and we can touch base that way. Thank you so much for staying and for attending this last day. And don't forget, our resources are up on the TransFormed page for you to download. So feel free to access those and download those. You can either individually download all the documents or you can download everything as one zip file.